good and evil, or good and conscience. The good is the true essence of the will in its universality. It is the true essence of the particular subject. Hence, the subject has an obligation or duty to will the good, to do good, not evil, right, not wrong, and to make the good his intention and realize it by his activity. In Hegel's words, for the subjective will, the good, and the good alone, is the essential, and the subjective will has value and dignity only insofar as its insight and intention accord with the good. But the subjective will only stands in a relation to the good, which is here only an abstract good. And the relation is that the good ought to be substantial for it. The will ought to make the good its aim and realize the good completely, while the good on its side has in the subjective will its only means of stepping into reality. So there's a problem. The good in morality is only an abstract good without any content. No principle of determination of the good is available. It is my individual subjective will or conscience that is to decide what the good is and if my actions are good or evil, right or wrong. And it is my subjective will that is a wholly particular, non-universal, non-objective will and subject to the promptings of my ego and lower nature. Therefore, not knowing what the true good is, I can do good as well as evil, and even convince myself that what is evil is good. Indeed, I can justify any action and can give a good reason or intention for doing the worst of things. For example, quote, I murdered so-and-so because he was a bad man, a corrupt politician, and by doing so, I reduced the amount of evil in the world. My action was therefore good. So anything can be made good. Thus, morality has no objective principle for determining what the good is. Hence, the good is determined arbitrarily. And there are further problems owing to the separation in the moral attitude between the subjective will and the external world. It is utterly contingent whether the two can coincide and be in harmony, whether good is realized in the world and not evil, whether the good subject becomes happy and the evil unhappy. But the world ought to let the good action be carried out in it, as it ought to grant the good subject satisfaction and happiness and refuse it to the evil subject, as it ought to abolish evil itself. As Hegel brilliantly says, quote, the all-round contradiction which this multiple ought expresses contains the mind's deepest descent into itself. And for this infinite depth of subjectivity, the universal will, the good, right, and duty, both is and is not. This subjectivity knows itself as what chooses and decides. Pure self-certainty rises to its peak and appears in the two forms of conscience and evil, which pass into each other. Conscience is the will of the good, which in this pure subjectivity is the non-objective, non-universal, the indescribable. The subject knows that he, in his individuality, has the decision. But evil is the very awareness of his individuality as the decision maker, giving itself the content of a subjective interest contrary to the good. However, this highest peak of the will, its absolute vanity as non-objective, self-certain goodness, immediately collapses. Evil, as subjectivity opposed to the objective and universal, is the same as the abstract good, since it leaves what the good is up to subjectivity. The result and truth of this sham is both the absolute nullity of this willing and the absolute nullity of this abstract good. To summarize, the moral dilemma concerns this descent into itself, into my inner subjectivity and particular will and conscience. My conscience is supposed to do what is good and right. But what is my duty, my obligation? What is good? What is a good action? What must I do in order to be good, for others and myself to regard my actions as good, and myself as good, and in possession of a good will? In essence, the moral law, my conscience, commands that I do and realize the good. But since I have no objective principle for determining the good, I am always on the verge of slipping into evil, of following my particularity, the impulses and desires of my lower selfish nature. The result is that I ought to will the good and make my particular will coincide with the universal rational will, but I cannot. What is the solution? The solution is the overcoming of the ought, essence, and relationship, which logically happens when we realize there is nothing to distinguish conscience, subject, from the good, object, for both are equally empty and abstract. Neither contains any principle or objective content telling us what we should or should not do, what our duties are, what the good is. Therefore, as indistinguishable, they both merge into one, into a unity. Their separation and the ought have been overcome, and the result, the unity of conscience, the will, and the good, of the subjective particular will and the objective universal rational will, is ethical life, the concrete actualization of the good, right, and freedom. Simply put, when I ongoingly do and fulfill the duties of the various roles prescribed to me by the ethical rational institutions of marriage, civil society, and the state, I am good. I have a good will and am continually actualizing the good in the world. And that the good is finally and truly realized in the will and in ethical life, in the state and its institutions, means first that the final end of the world, kingdom come, has absolutely nothing to do with changes in the physical, visible world and a future time when we'll all be living in architecturally beautiful futuristic cities where there is a cure for every disease and even physical immortality. No, the final end involves only the good, the will, the inner, not the outer, mind, consciousness. As Jesus said, quote, "The kingdom comes not by observation or the senses. For behold, the kingdom of God is within you." So it involves nothing in the future, no change, clean cities, sidewalks, buildings, everyone with ample food, clothing, pleasure, nothing, only good wills. And the realization of the good in ethical life and the state means, secondly, as Hegel said in his Jena writings, that the state, that is, the present world, the United States of America, is precisely and nothing other than the fully realized and actual kingdom of God on earth. This is the truth, a fact, that only needs to become common knowledge to be experienced in the here and now. Lastly, as to why the good can't be realized in morality, only in ethical life. In sum, mainly because, one, the good and subjectivity in morality are not yet one, but separate, e.g., I ought to do the good, but cannot. 2, the good is still only abstract or formal, without any content or specification, hence empty. 3, the same is true of my subjective will or conscience. It is empty and abstract, lacking an objective principle for determining the good. 4, since I do not know what the good, my duty is, I thus tend to follow my lower desires, my particularity, not universality. I tend towards evil and think that evil is really good. And 5, in ethical life, with the unity of the subjective will and the good, all of these problems vanish and the good is fully realized. Finally, the good, then, is the idea as the unity of the concept of the will with the particular will. And hence, the good must be actualized through the particular will. Thus, the good has absolute right against the abstract right of property and the particular aims of welfare. The good is therefore freedom realized, the absolute end and aim of the world.